Charleston. Let me get rid of that. Like I said, the College of Charleston, the Environmental and Sustainability Studies group specifically, and the Charleston Climate Coalition, and then there's a whole host of other groups. But we are going to talk to the mayors of, or the people who want to potentially be mayor, the candidates. We want to talk to them and get their take. You know, how are they going to lead Charleston on the environment? You know, we've got a lot of environmental issues in Charleston, and we want to know, what are they going to do about transportation? What are they going to do about the buildings? What are they going to do about climate policy? So this is our chance to hear that straight from the horse's mouth. And then there is an event coming up in September at Tradesman's Brewery. If you want to see all these new EVs that are coming out, this is a chance for you to get out there and touch and feel and look and see what they, you know, what do they look like? What do they do? How do they drive? There's potential that you could test drive them. Sounds like a good event. We are looking for volunteers for this event. The County of Charleston and the City of Charleston are both hosting this. And if anybody's interested, we will put this on our social media and on our website and in our next newsletter. So you can sign up. All right, next month we're going to have Dr. Tom O'Halloran. He is going to be explaining what a ghost forest is and why we should care about that. So this is, I'll give you a hint, it has something to do with climate change.
And Halloween.
Oh, it's Halloran?
And Halloween.
Oh, and Halloween. Yes, sorry, I didn't even catch that. Yes, we're gonna have the ghost forest talk on. All right, tonight we got Ruth Miller. She's been a tour guide in Charleston for quite some time, and she owned her own company giving tours, and she has written many books. They're on the back table back there. Those are some samples of her books.
They could not put them out because people would take them home. So they're not out. They're up here.
Oh, okay. So she does have samples of her books if you'd like to see them. They're just samples, and yeah. So Alec Cooley here, he and Ruth worked together on this guide, Slavery to Civil Rights, Welcome to Our African American Charleston. They co-wrote this, and I happened to design it. So yeah, so Ruth is gonna give us some history of Carolina Low Country naturalists. Yes, I am.
Who's the little guy in the corner? Black ones.
Oh yeah,
Somebody?
I think we can get rid of it.
Yeah.
Oh, apparently that's the man we're doing that.
Okay.
that is Robert.
You can
Yeah.
push it up, slide it up to the upper bottom.
Okay.
Maybe turn clear.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I'm gonna sit down. Usually people can hear me very clearly.
Yeah.
There's no podium, so I'm nothing to lean on. Okay. So I'm gonna welcome you to the natural philosophers, and this is a word we don't hear much anymore. Whoops, what do I do?
Get that one to be ready.
Get that one ready to go. Yeah. Okay. So welcome to the world of the natural philosophers, but to get us into their world, we have to go back and look at how it originated. So up at the top, I have the first map giving you an idea of how we are going to go from Europe around the world. And I will tell you that virtually everything we do here is very Eurocentric, because you can see clearly from the map, Europe takes the reins and goes around the world without any question. So we're going to start in the early 1400s, and Portugal is going to sail off to Madeira, which they, by the way, still own. And then they are going to start exploring the coast of Africa. And then we're going to get the Spanish charge in there. You can see on the map, the Spanish beat out the Portuguese. Number one. Matter of fact, by 1750, the most widely spoken language in the world is still Chinese, which it is today. The 1750s, want to know what the second most popular language in the world was, or widely spoken? It was Spanish. And it maintains today Spanish. So if you want to think in terms of that, the Spanish in their own way conquered the world too. But then go 150 years later and look what happens. Now, all of a sudden, the Spanish have been kicked aside by whom? The British. It's all about sea power. And this is just an amazing map to me. This is from the logs of all of the sea captains. These are the English sea captains. So this is actually made up from their logs. They kept very, very good records. Thank goodness for us. The English. And I think of this as the Atlantic world, but as we look at it, we have all grown up pretty much hearing it's the age of discovery and it's the age of exploration. But we're looking at it again from that European viewpoint. And if you think about it, to the rest of the world, this is actually the age of invasions and the invade and colonization. So we have to try to bear that in mind throughout our talk, that we're always trying to look for what we don't hear about, because it didn't get recorded in the history books, so much of it, especially with the written languages and the spoken languages. So, all right, whoops.
Sorry, I had to do this.
Oh, yeah, we're going to share with the people. Okay.
Okay, can you see it at home now?
So what's going to happen out of this period of time? England, now you see, is going to be, it's the third language in the world. However, what do you think the second language everybody learns is? It's English. And I really believe if there's nothing else that English accomplished, or the British accomplished in all this great trading, is they actually did give the world a language that pretty much everybody, this is the second language in the world today, is English.
What was the primary language first?
Pardon?
Chinese.
Chinese, and Chinese is still number one. But virtually nobody is today studying Chinese as a second language, whereas you see English is the second language people study. And there's a very clear reason for that, and it's very visible in this map, and that is English is the language of business. You cannot do business in the world, even in China, if you don't speak English. And so this is why it's so important to see what's happened. But always bear in mind, although English is that language, they're still in the rest of the world learning it as a second language, but they're seeing the Europeans as invaders and as colonizers. You can't just erase that part of the history. Okay, so what's going to happen is this is going to be the age of what we call the natural philosophers. And philosophy is the love of wisdom, but what happens back in the 1700s, 1600s, the love of wisdom is also all mixed up with the study of nature and history. It's all mixed up together. And it's a day and age when people could be a mathematician, but they're interested in astronomy, and they're interested in plants, and they're interested in bugs. And there's not so much knowledge about one topic that you can't go out and just dabble in almost everything. So these are going to be the natural philosophers. The word science as a study is not even used at that time. The word scientist doesn't really enter the vocabulary until the 18th century. And so we want to think always of natural philosophers. Okay, so, well, do I have to aim it or something? I thought I was supposed to just push it to the left and it changed. It worked a minute ago. I didn't change anything.
I know, that's what I'm saying. It worked a minute ago. I don't know why it's working.
Here we go. Okay, look at this tremendous change and what goes on in the Atlantic world. It's just really a pretty amazing thing to look at, not just the plants that are moving around the world, look at the animals that are moving around the world, and look at the diseases that are moving around the world. It's just an amazing exchange that happens, because up until this great trade, it's all been in isolation. And so this is what the national the natural philosophers are just really getting fascinated with. All these new things are coming that they want to document it. And one of the most important things to understand about these men, and they're going to be men in particular, just because that was the educational system in those days, but I do have a few women I can throw in along the way. But what these men are really, really interested in is trying to discover things, find how they work and how they fit together. They're really trying to put the world together and to see what is going on. So what is going to happen is that they are going to, let's see, it worked this time. So now we are in England, right? And what we're going to do is we are going to have the creation of the Royal Society of London for the improvement of natural knowledge. In other words, they're natural philosophers. That's what they call themselves. And so they're trying to put this all together. And one of the most important things to understand is, as I say, they're so widely interested and so widely knowledgeable. So the Royal Society actually has its first meeting in 1660, 2 years before its founding. And it begins when a man named Christopher Wren gives a talk at Gresham College. Now, you may have heard of Christopher Wren. He's normally known as an architect. You know what he taught? He taught astronomy. It's just a wonderful example of that cross culture. So he's teaching us, he's a professor of astronomy, but he's designing all these buildings in England that the Charlestonians are copying, by the way. We have Christopher Wren copies all over our city. All right, so the Royal Society is then going to be founded 2 years later. And if you're not familiar too much with our history, this is just 2 years after we are going to have the King of England, Charles II. He's the one that's going to send the people over here. He's already given away the Carolinas. He gave the Carolinas away to 8 of his supporters. And those 8 supporters are figuring out how they're going to make money off of all this property. So at the same time, he gives a charter to the Royal Society. And that's from then on, they're just generally called the Royal Society. But this is all just contemporaneous with what's going on here. Because Ashley Cooper and his friends are trying to figure out how to make money off of the Carolinas. And at that time, you might not be aware, but Carolina was the Virginia border to St. Augustine, Florida. So you got everything south of Virginia to St. Augustine. Okay, so why did I put up the gardens? Because at the same point of time, in the mid-1600s, you've got these physic gardens, and that might be a term that you're not familiar with, but so much of medicine at that time is actually going to be involved with plants and herbs. And so physic gardens, they're medicinal gardens. They're gardens that are established for the doctors, and all the great medical schools had their own physic garden. So one of the earliest ones is going to be up in Scotland, the medical school for Edinburgh. So we're going to have one up here in Scotland. I put this one up here because, and they still have it, but this is the Chelsea Physic Garden. And the reason I put it up here is because this is one that is more familiar to people, especially if they go to London, they like to go see it. It's so neat and it's so well maintained. But one of the things about them, think about it, it's a medicinal garden. It's not a flower garden. It's not a butterfly garden. It's a medicinal garden. So don't be surprised. You'll see things like dandelions. Because there's the medical quality, you're going to find it there. And so much of medicine is so involved at that time with the plants. So here's a good example of what goes on with that trade back and forth around the Atlantic world. So we've got malaria. Malaria actually is an original disease that's going to, it's going to originate in Africa, makes its way to Europe, and then across, especially in the slave trade. It doesn't take it long at all to get across here. But we've got the Spanish out there, and they're in Lima, Peru, and the governor's wife gets sick. And the indigenous people in Lima, Peru, are giving the Jesuits this bark off of a tree, and they treat her with it, and she gets healthy. And what is this tree? The tree is going to be the cinchona tree, which has quinine. And all of a sudden, everybody discovers, oh my goodness, here's a new medication. The Jesuits go into business selling the bark of that tree to the Europeans. So what are you going to plant in your physic garden? The tree that gives you quinine. So the physic gardens are very important to understand because in this great trade, they're planting things from all over the world. And who will be the key to looking for these plants? It's the doctors. Because this is how doctors are curing people back in those days. So we'll go up and think about that. We've got the Royal Society is established. We have the physic gardens have been established. And some people actually think of them as doing it's the household garden that even in the settlements and in the colonies you're going to have because everybody had a garden in their backyard and they're growing herbs back in their backyards. And those in a way were medicinal gardens too. They just weren't professionally maintained. And by the way, the doctors didn't establish these gardens. It was the Society of the Apothecaries. So the doctors study the gardens, but the apothecaries, the pharmacist you would think of it today, is the one that actually is keeping the garden going. And the one that was established in London, the Chelsea one, is right on the Thames River, so that the ships could dock right away and deliver those plants. All right, so let us move on to our first person. John Lawson, the question mark is because there's a big debate about whether or not this is really John Larson. But what we have in this Royal Society is they're looking for a talent of minds, not a talent of aristocrats. Let me get the word right. They're not looking for aristocrats with money. They're looking for talent of the mind. They're looking for people that are curious, that are collecting, that can make connections. And so here's John Lawson. He's from an average family over in England, but he manages to take a few classes at Gresham College. Why is that important? That's where the Royal Society is. And like any young man who is curious and wants to get ahead, he wants to get into the Royal Society. But how you get in, you have to be nominated, and you have to be nominated because you have done something really important that the natural philosophers respect. You have to collect information. You have to keep documents. You have to have samples. Otherwise, they're not even going to look at you. So John Lawson is thinking, how can I get into the Royal Society? He's taken some courses and he decides, okay, I'm going to head down to Italy and see what I can do in Italy. There's some investigations going on there in archaeology and digging up things. And so he says, okay, he's going to head down to Rome. Well, it so happens he's now 25 years old. And on his way, he happens to run into this man who we think we know who he is now. But he just recorded that he met a man who was very well traveled and suggested, you know, if you really want to get ahead, go to Carolina. Things are happening in Carolina. And so John Lawson, and then this man offers him free passage. He says there's a ship leaving in 3 days. Free passage to Carolina. Okay. So, I mean, you're 25 years old, you want to go adventure and make a name for yourself. So off he goes to Carolina. And when he arrives here, he actually is going to stay. And I've lost his name, but anyway, he stays with his last name was Moore in Charleston. Now he decides, okay, he is going to have to find these plants, find these animals. He's going to explore it. Anything he can do to write a paper to get into this Royal Society, and in the meantime, can also make a name for himself. So he is going to take a trip, and there you see the map. He's going to pull out of Charleston. He's in a dugout canoe. Don't think something little. These dugout canoes at that time were huge. He had actually a party of 7 people with him. 3 of them were native inhabitants, one of whom had his wife. So, and then he had 5 Englishmen. So this is how they start off. They take a canoe, actually, ocean, out up to the Santee River, and then they head up the Santee River. And then he is going to take this trip along the way. Pretty much everybody drops off but a couple of his Indian guides. And even then he starts swapping guides because they're dropping off. He has such a natural philosopher's mind that he is doing this deliberately. He keeps a diary. Every night he sits down and he writes down what has happened, what is going on, what he's found. He starts collecting different things to take along with him and to wrapping them up. And he's very, very sincerely empathetic with the Indians. Absolutely. And by the way, I'm told it's very okay to use the term Indian along with native inhabitants or indigenous people. It's not considered an insult, because I know some people get very uptight about words these days, but that's a very acceptable term to use. Okay, so he feels very, very much empathy for these Native Americans, and he starts writing down about them. His trip is actually 550 miles, a long trip. He accomplishes it in about 2 months, and you see where he ends up. He ends up in what is North Carolina today. And what's he going to do? He's going to claim a whole bunch of land and he's going to create a town. I mean, this man is out to really make something of himself. But in the meantime, he's writing down everything, So he is going to found the town of Bath in North Carolina. And he built himself a big house there. And so we have him there. But in the meantime, he's taking everything that he has and he started to put it in the book. And the Lord Proprietors, because King Charles II, we have King Charles III now. King Charles II does not own Carolina. We were not a royal colony at this time. We're still owned by the Lord Proprietors. So the Lord Proprietors are going to make him the surveyor of Carolina. He actually gets a title now. So he's going to be making a little money from the Lord Proprietors, a commission, you might think. But in the meantime, he's collected, he's written his book, and now he is going to go back to England to get it published. So he is the first really good describer we have of what this place was like and what the native peoples were like before they had come into the white communities. So he describes everything. Here's what he says about palm trees. The palm trees, this is our palmetto tree, our state tree. He said the leaves only grow on the top of the tree in the shape of a fan in a cluster, like a cabbage. The tree in Carolina, why the utmost growth is about 40 or 50 feet in height. But then he goes on and interesting, he says, it shows the flower growth that is as a vegetable. The wood is very porous and stringy, like a cane. The leaves are used by the Bermudians. He's putting this world, see, he's read all of these other books that are out there. It's used by the Bermudians, those in Bermuda, for making hats, for making baskets, and pretty dressing boxes, a great deal being transported, interesting, to Pennsylvania. What's this national trade? They're being made in Bermuda and sold in Pennsylvania, but hey, they're here in Carolina. We can start an industry in Carolina with palmetto leaves, okay? And then the northern parts, well, they're going they're going up to Philadelphia and northern parts of America because they will not grow there. And then the people of Carolina also make fans of this tree. Brooms are very serviceable and are used to sweep the houses. He's really looking at economics and industry with all these plants, not just, hey, this is a pretty interesting tree. What can we do with this tree? He describes the passenger pigeons, which we know are now quite extinct. But he talks about the passenger pigeons, and he says when we shoot them, they're so numerous in these parts that you'll see millions in a flock. Sometimes they split off the limbs of the stout oak trees. They're so heavy when they roost at night. And you will find in several Indian towns, if not above 17 houses, they have more than 100 balloons of pigeon oil or pigeon fat. A balloon, I'm sure, is going to be where you would take intestine of an animal, usually cow stomachs or such. They would do cows in the end. But anyway, if you take the stomach, that's going to be the balloon that was used to contain it. biodegradable in those days. So they're saving the fat. This is what they use for butter. Like he equates it to what the Europeans are using for butter. The natives are using the fat of the pigeons. That's their butter. Okay. They go out at night with a light pole and they kill thousands of them at night. They're all roosting in the trees. They don't fly. Okay. He talks about where it's observable whenever these fowls come in such numbers that I see them, that everything is clear before them. Listen to this. They scarce leave an acorn upon the ground, which doubtless is a great prejudice to these planters, because should the pigeons seed there, the swine will deprive their pigs of mast. So we got to kill these pigeons off because they're going to eat up all the acorns and we have nothing to feed our pigs. He's thinking about farming, he's thinking about plantations. So instead of looking at them as a source of fat like Native Americans does, he says, no, we need to get rid of these pigeons because they're eating the acorns and we can't keep all these feral hogs. Well, they weren't feral in those days, they're feral now, but big problem now. But, so that, and by the way, that's another one of the animals that's brought over in this trade. So, are the porcine. Okay, and then here's a really interesting one. He talks about their butcheries. Now, again, this is a European perspective. So he said that they strive to invent the most inhuman butcheries. This is what they say, butcheries for their enemies that the devils themselves could invent or hammer out of hell. They esteem death as not a punishment, but rather an advantage, because then you will be exported out of this into the next world. So very clearly he's saying they have an image of the next world. So what do? You make them suffer, is what you make them do. Therefore, they inflict all kinds of torments, wherein they prolong the life in as miserable a state as they can think. So what is one of the things they do? They never miss sculpting of them. This is your enemy. You can figure out what that's sculpting. What's the sculpting of an enemy? Continues on. As the Indians call it, it's to cut the skin off of their temples and take the whole head of hair along with them. Scalping, we would say. They're calling it sculpting back in those days. Okay? And he said, and they wear it as a nightcap. Here's the other one. They split pitch pine into splinters and stick it into the prisoner's body while yet alive. You look like a porcupine. Then they light them, which burn like so many torches. And in this manner, they make you dance around a great fire, everyone buffeting and deriding you until you expire. So that's another way we're going to get rid of people. But I want us to put ourselves into the worldview of the Native Americans. They're saying, remember this, death is a gift. We're going to make you suffer. So they come up with ways to torture. All right, so Lawson now is going to put together his book. He is going to go on, and he is going to go to England. He's going to publish his book. And then when he comes back, he is going to bring a whole bunch of new settlers. He's going to create a new town. He made a deal with a guy in Germany, and we're going to build a whole new town. I've got this great location up here, and he brings them back, and he founds the next city in, or town, it's a city today, but next town in North Carolina, which is going to be New Bern. Where do a lot of these people come from? Switzerland. That's why it's called New Bern. And if you're not aware of it, that was the capital of the Carolinas, of North Carolina at one time, New Bern. So he comes back, and now he's got a whole new town. His back is already going good. He's created this whole new town, and he goes out exploring, and he's looking for a nice hillside where he can put up his home here. He's going to build himself a home on a hillside. And he runs into some of the Tuscarora Indians, and they say, we don't want this whole new town here. Our hunting grounds are being trampled upon. You know, no, go away. And so Lawson's been getting along all these years, and he's not about to leave. He's got an investment, and so what's going to happen? You want to guess how he's killed by the Indians? Like a porcupine. In other words, he described on his earlier crusade the torture, and ironically, it's the same torture that was used to put him to death. So it was an adventure to be a natural historian, but it can be dangerous too.
Did he ever get into the Royal Society?
Pardon?
Did he ever get accepted into the
The
Royal Society?
question is, did he make it into the Royal Society? He didn't. No, because he hadn't lived long enough. His book had only come out 2 years before. Book had just been published, so didn't make it. No, we feel sorry for him. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have brought this up. I forget what pictures I have. So here's his book, and you can see it's printed in the year 1709, and he died as a porcupine just 2 years later. But it is considered the best primary source we have on Carolina in the early days of settlement, because he did go to some of these places long before any white people had been there, and he documented. And I think the other interesting thing is to point out how these natural philosophers are also looking at making money in economics too. So it's not just descriptive, it's how can I use this new discovery? What can I do with it? Okay, so now we're going to go on to Mark Catesby. And all of a sudden, for some reason, there's been this huge interest in Mark Catesby, so there's lots of new books coming out on him. The most important thing about Catesby is that he actually is documenting these plants, particularly long before Audubon. Everybody knows Audubon. Audubon was such a good promoter, and Audubon's coming along about 100 years later, so he's had lots of time to get publicity going around the country, but this is back in the very early days. So Mark Catesby is going to come over here, and he makes one trip to America. The first time he actually is going to go into around in Virginia. He's going to be financed. He had read Lawson's book, by the way. That was one of the things that had gotten him interested, that he was going to come over here. But he is looking mostly for plants and their opportunity for medicines, food, and clothing. So he's really interested in plants. And he also wants to get into the Royal Society. Boy, this is a driving force with these people to get into the Royal, and the Royal Society helps to sponsor him. They do help to sponsor him. And they announce that they want plants, whether they're living or dead, you gotta get us some plants, okay? Because they're trying to organize the world, and they want things for the physic gardens. That's what they're looking for, things for the physic gardens. So he gets a wave of interest, and he's sponsored to come to Carolina. He's going to come here to Charleston in the year 1722. So we're just on the cusp of when we're becoming a royal colony. When he arrives here, and he sets up his headquarters in Charleston, and then he starts going all around. He is sponsored by lots of different people, and he has to keep finding things to keep the Royal Society happy. So he keeps sending things back, specimens, and he sends them to people in Paris, in Leiden, in Danzig, not just in London. This is an international connection going on here. He describes the gardens in Ansonborough, and we have good descriptions of the Ansonborough gardens from the local people like Henry Lawrence. He actually hired an English groundskeeper to design his garden for him. So he describes the Charleston gardens, and he is just really trying to keep the Royal Society happy. He says, by the way, that ours are gently laid out in walks in alleys with flower knots and laid around to support them. So they never comment, by the way, on the majority of our society, which is very much African American by that time. So our city had a Black majority by the year 1710. You virtually never hear them, ever. And our brick is all slave-made brick. All slave-made brick. Okay, so he heads off to the Bahamas. He goes back to England. He's just traveling around, and he gets these sponsors. And I thought the sponsors are really, really interesting. the Prince of Liechtenstein, Her Majesty Queen Caroline, the Imperial Majesty of Russia. These are his sponsors. The Right Honorable Lord Carteret, we have Carteret here. And then this one I like because one of his sponsors, recognize the bird, what's he call it? The Baltimore bird, right? Anybody remember what the flag of Maryland looks like? It's the coat of arms of the Lord Baltimore. It's it's orange and black. He names the bird after his sponsor. So they know how to get ahead, get your name out, get there. So, he sponsored me. Okay, I'm going to name a bird after him. So the Baltimore Oriole is named for his sponsor. And he's going to have a lot of contact with John Bartram. And I'll talk a little more about him later. But Bartram's up in Philadelphia, so we're trying to do Carolina right now. So we'll hear about Bartram a little later. He's going to give lots of different names. He gives a lot of Latin names. You can see him putting his Latin names up there. There's the tulip poplar. He calls it Tuliparia. And I thought this was kind of cute. He gives the lady slipper the name Cypripedium. So we know what lady slippers look like. Cypripedium, that means the Cypriot's shoe, because he thought it looked like a beautiful lady's shoe. Venus is supposed to have come from Cyprus. And so we're going to name it after Venus's shoe. That's where the lady slipper gets its name. You never know with these Latin names. He gives the name the skunk cabbage. He gives that the Latin name Simplicarpius, which just means a simple hand. And if most people in here have seen what the skunk cabbage looks like. So he calls it Simplicarpius. It's a simple hand, and it's Botidius. Well, there's a clue there. Fetid is the English word. Stinky. It's a stinky hand. That's what he calls the skunk cabbage. It was really fun to look at these Latin words and see what how they get there, what they call them. And that's really appropriate. It does look more like a hand than a cabbage. Doesn't look like much like a cabbage at all. Okay, so we're going to move on now. We're getting into our Latin. We have to go Carl Linnaeus. We can't leave Carl Linnaeus out of this. And he is so into Latin, he even changes his name. So he changes his name to a Latin name. Why is he so important? If Linnaeus had not come along and done what he did do, we would not be Homo sapiens. He is the one that decided, okay, all these crazy names are coming in from all over the world, and we don't know who's talking about what. We're going to come up with a universal naming process. And he's going to use the language of the academics, which is Latin. And so he's going to put a Latin name on everything. And he prints his first book in Latin. And I love it that he gave himself a Latin name. He doesn't use his Swedish name. So what do you think he studied? Medicine. We're back into this medicine. And he had actually gone to Europe. I think he was in Netherlands, I believe. Anyway, he's down in Europe studying, and then he goes back to Sweden, and he is the chair of medicine and the chair of botany. The two are so close together. And he has his physic garden in Sweden, but he can't grow a lot of these plants because of the climate that he's so interested in. He is very into identifying plants through their sex. Everything he does is that all organisms, he said, all organisms reproduce by sex, and he expected every plant to possess both a male and a female sex organ. This is really scandalous in a lot of the society at that time. And how does he label them? He says they're husbands and wives. So he has a very, very simple system. Is the number and the positions of the stamen, those are the husbands, right? And then the number and the position of the pistils, those are the wives. And when we put the two together, we have sex and we get a seed. Well, it becomes scandalous. It's really kind of funny because some of the people would have nothing to do with it. They would say, and these are the natural historians, but they didn't like his sex thing. And this is Erasmus Darwin. He was actually Charles Darwin's grandfather. he took and he wrote a widely published poem about the sex. He takes this simple calendula, this pretty little flower, it looks like a daisy of calendula, they're yellow, the ones we have around here. And he talks about, here it is out there seducing the beetle to come and to make it grow and to reproduce. So this beetle flits around amongst the calendula and it mossy crouches down inside, and the cold dew of her love illumined form. This is love going on in calendula, right? From leaf to leaf, we are carrying the virgin bright, the pollen. The virgin bright is going from leaf to leaf, and then finally we're going to fill with golden flame the winged urn, and we're going to light and press it ponderous on the air, and the pistil falls resistless. That pistil does not have lost her virginity. Okay, so, but it's kind of interesting how the natural historians are looking at this like, you know, okay, this is a good way to classify. Some of them were not so quick to accept that. Some of them didn't like all the sex getting involved. But that is going to be how Linnaeus decides to look at reproduction. Okay, so we're going to move past Linnaeus now. We all know that you have to have Latin in order to be important. And let's get over here to Charleston. So by now, we are the city of Charleston. We have gotten very, very wealthy. We are the richest per capita in North America. We had more money per capita than they had in New York City. And yet we were one of only four. There are only 4 cities in North America, in British North America. Those are going to be Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. We were as big as Boston and had more money per capita than New York. That was the city, all based on the plantation society and slave labor. Remember, we have slave labor. So here's a couple women that I am able to put in here for you. And this is going to be, I have to finish by 12:30. Okay. I'm going to zip through, but I wanted to give you, first of all, Mrs. Elizabeth Pitt Lamble, because she's a really interesting story. She actually is a native of Boston, Massachusetts, and then apparently becomes very, very poor. And this is the days of what they call the Great Awakening. Everybody, George Whitfield's going around and reviving religion with everybody. And so she apparently was left as an orphan as a teenager. And at the age of 14, she was shipped down to Savannah, Georgia, to go to the school for the poor orphans that was being run by George Whitfield's church. It was actually called the George Whitfield Bethesda Orphan House. So she's sent down to Savannah, and they're giving them good instruction in religion. But amazing thing about this, they're also teaching Latin. She actually studied Latin at the orphanage. I don't think we've dumbed down education today. Arithmetic, all these different things, and they are taught household tasks. That's a good thing. And then here's what happens in the vacant hours. The girls, quote, were employed in the garden and plantation work, a very extensive one, and is well kept upon the best I have ever seen in America. That's a description of the garden that these girls kept. Okay, so at the age of, let's see, she's 16 years old. Excuse me, she's 15 years old. She comes to Charleston and apparently was working in a house as a household servant in a house. Remember, she's white and she's educated. And by the age of 16, she gets married. So she is going to be the third wife of one of our Charlestonians. And she's 18, he's 33. So she's going to get married, and he is very, very wealthy. He has lots of property. This is the house. This is the Charleston single house he had. And he already had a large garden because his first 2 wives liked to garden. So his first 2 wives already had a big garden there on the side of their single house. And she's going to extend it even further. It said the Lambles had a large rose garden on the White Point. That would be where the battery is today. They separated by a narrow strip of land, so they had a rose garden down where the battery is, but you had to take a little boat to get to them. Interesting rose garden. She develops a friendship with John Bartram. Here's that name again, the guy up in Philadelphia. He's the big king's to-do, the big supplier to the king, and everybody knows. I mean, he's giving plants to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and there's still, you can still go visit that garden. His son's going to take it over. It's part of the national landmark today. So Bartram's garden is still to some extent there for us to be aware of. But Bartram is going to be so important. He was essentially the premier botanist in the colonies. That's how people describe him. And so he is going to have everybody shipping him everything. And then George III made him the royal botanist. So he actually was the royal botanist to the English colonies. His garden was 1,100 acres. So here's what happens is he's writing letters back and forth to our Mrs. Lamble asking for plants. And she sends him packet after packet of plants, lots of different things. And she is going to send him, amongst some of them, and I put it up here, she sends him the umbrella magnolia. That's one of the plants that she's going to send him. So here we have this woman, and this is interesting because almost all of the correspondence is done by her husband, Thomas. But Thomas is being told to get his wife to do these things because she's more reliable. And Bartram writes to other people that Elizabeth, I always forget her first name because they're all calling, it's always Mrs. Lamble. Anyway, he's telling everybody that Mrs. Lamble is a much more reliable supplier of goods than ever her husband is. So if you really want something from Charleston, tell him to get his wife to fetch it because he won't bother. So I think it's really interesting. She's the one that's doing all this, but he's the one that gets credit because he writes the letters. But he does in the letters here that go get your wife to do it. And then you realize they're going to have slave labor. So they're going to have enslaved people that are doing this work. But she was a gardener. She had been raised in the orphanage to garden. Okay, and then we have the first garden calendar in North America, also published in Charleston. What an intellectual center this was. What an educational center this was. And so this is a lady who is Daniel Island. You're familiar with that. This is Daniel Island. And she, at a very, very young age, is going to be orphaned. She gets a plantation when she's 13 years old of thousands of acres. Okay. It was thousands of acres. I've lost track of how much it was. But so thousands of acres. It's on the Wando, Daniel Island. She's 13 years old. Women obviously can't own property. Well, might not be obvious today, but women can't own property. Everything's always going to be in trust to a male. And so there's a male in trust that within a year, she's now 14, she's going to get married. Okay. And she is going to have 8 children. But along the way, apparently her husband is not much of a money manager, because we find that they start selling things off left and right. She ends up coming into Charleston and teaching in a school. This is along with her 8 children. But remember, she has no control over the funds. Women have no control over the funds whatsoever. At that point in time, under the law, when it's her dowry or her inheritance, there's always a male trustee who can fritter it away. And then upon marriage, all the property becomes the sole property of the man. The wife has no rights to that property. And so they can gamble it away too. But it's a whole different world. And by the way, I think one of the most important things is to understand history stays with it. Our state still did not allow married women to own their own house in the year 1982. A married woman still had no right to own her house, if you didn't know that. 1982. Okay, so anyway, we're going to go on with her, and she is going to now move into Charleston. They're going to sell their land, and she is going to start a nursery, plant nursery. She's going to start a plant nursery, and she has a boarding school, doing everything she can to make money. For some reason, Dr. Garden, who I've got to get to here, but Dr. Garden and she were odds. Dr. Garden's very important. He's our next person. That they wouldn't speak to each other. I don't know what was going on there, but something between them. However, she is very much in contact with Bartram up there in Philadelphia, and she's sending things to Bartram in Philadelphia. And she's advertising in the newspapers. Here's one of her ads. A parcel of very good seed, flower, roots, and fruit stones to be sold at the Trotts Point Green tomorrow. So it's instant in those days, but it meant tomorrow. So here she is selling this thing. She's out there peddling seeds and plants and roots and tubers and doing all these things. And she's publishing the very first garden from the very fourth year. So again, very, very good. And I love the month of May. This month is chiefly for weeding and watering. Nothing sown or planted does well. So not a month to plant in May. And I'm sure she was doing all her work because she could not afford slaves. So Bartram actually comes down and meets her from Philadelphia. He meets with her. He's been getting things. They've been exchanging plants. And here's how he describes her when he meets her in person: an elderly widow lady who spares no pains or cost to oblige me. Her garden is a delight. So this is the royal botanist saying this about this lady in Charleston, South Carolina. And by the way, when he describes her as elderly, she's 56 years old. You know, 8 children. This woman really survived a lot. She survived a lot. And she lived to a decent age. Back in those days, the average was 1/3 of us would die by the age of 8, 2/3 of us died by the age of 18. After that, we tended to live indefinitely because we'd been through the diseases. And then after the age of 18, the majority of men die by accident, like falling off horses or at sea, and the majority of women die in childbirth. So it's again a different perspective on populations back in this time. Okay, I've got to get us up to Dr. Gardner. There again, I'll be done. That's why I can see. I keep my clock. Okay, question mark. There's an issue. Is this really Dr. Gardner or not? Half the people say no.
Yes, I want you to put in this, okay?
Might be.
Okay.
Okay, this is the building that's today Fast and French, the restaurant. So his house was next door where the
You
county.
got yours. They're good?
What did I do?
You thought you yours?
Did I do
I have no, somebody was talking.
Oh, it's all fun. Okay, so this is Fast and French, the restaurant. When they were building the courthouse, his home had long gone, but there was an addition tacked on the back end of Fast and French that they're pretty sure was the kitchen house to Dr. Gardner's mansion. And there was a big issue with the Preservation Society of trying to say that it got demolished. So it's gone. But this is the front of where his kitchen house would have been, and then to the left is where his mansion would have been. So Gardner is actually a Scotsman, and a lot of people in this room are gonna at least think they recognize his name because the gardenia is named for him. But what I want to do is I want to show you that's not why he's important. That's just the romance of the gardenia. Because here's what we're going to learn about him. So he's a Scottish doctor. He's in Edinburgh, medical school in Edinburgh. And then there we go, another one of these garden medical people, very, very interested in the physic garden. He is going to get a job as a naval surgeon. And so he travels over and he gets to Charleston. Hey, this is a good place to put down roots. You know, here I am, one of the best medical schools in the known world at that time, European centric. And so he's going to settle here. They were a desperate need for doctors. There are a couple here. They're all into natural philosophy. Dr. Chalmers, Dr. Bull. And so, and they've got these books, and you've got more and more books to read, all these early books that are going around. And so Dr. Gardner is going to try to get in with Linnaeus. Linnaeus is the man. Now you want to be in the Royal Society, right? And you also want to get recognized by Linnaeus because he's the one that's getting so involved in naming everything. And so he keeps writing letters to Linnaeus and not getting anything back. But in the meantime, he becomes very, very good friends with a man named Ellis in London, who was another one of these very prominent natural historians. And finally, Ellis actually forwards a letter to Linnaeus and says, pay attention to this man in Charleston. He's really got something, and he can get us stuff. And so this is what I love, because Linnaeus writes back, well, all right, it died then. Linnaeus writes back, I really want fish. He is not interested in plants. He says, I want to see some fish. Well, not that he's not interested, but his exact words were, I think that think about fish. Before you receive, oh, he said, I want fish. And this is what Gordon writes back. Before receipt of your letter, I scarcely paid any attention to our fishes. That's what he put. But suddenly he wants to look at Linnaeus. And so what he's going to do is, he didn't know anything about fish. He didn't know how to catch fish. Who do you think he used to go catch all these fish and find these fish? He used enslaved people. And so this is one of those stories, and I really think this is something I might be interested in doing, because we know that he had enslaved people and perhaps a free person of color that were collecting for him, one of whom actually went to Providence Island in the Caribbean to collect for Garden and bring it back, which is why I think he was a free person of color. Anyway, these are people we can track down because we have all those records, especially free people of color. They're all in the censuses. So I think this might be something to go tracking down. But anyway, so here's one of the things, and since I've got all the outdoor people, how many of you recognize the mud iguana? Supposedly they're very common all along the Carolina coast. Supposedly. And it's not a fish, and it's not an eel, it's a salamander.
I've seen something
You
like
see
that in California, but not here.
We see them in California. Well, supposedly they're very common all along the low country coast. This is why they found one and they sent it over. And what you can see is that this is John Ellis, his friend, who got him recognized by Linnaeus. He actually gave a presentation on this animal, and he gives him credit, and he says he's got a new genus there. Guess what's going to happen in a couple of years? He's going to get into the Royal Society. Yes, he is going to get into the Royal Society. Another one, this is kind of fun. This, and I have to go really fast here because I want to get to the end. But we have the sea captain that shows up in Charleston with electric eels that are still alive. And since everybody's into electricity, and by the way, we've got good old, all these people. Lean has done the same kite, that's another doctor here in town. He does the kite experiment that Franklin had done. And then we've got Garden has talked to Franklin. Everybody's looking into electricity, and this guy shows up with electric eels. And he's charging $1 a piece. This is back in the 1700s, $1 a piece to go see these eels. It's interesting. And they think if you put your finger in the water, it helps to heal. There's all kinds of things going on about these electric eels. Garden wants to buy one, but he can't. He said, well, at least he says this, and this is what Garden, we have to give him credit for, because he said, okay, I don't think they're going to survive all the way to London, because the Captain Baker Barker, he knows he can make a lot more money in London than he's ever going to make in Charleston selling these electric eels, because they never had a live one over there. So Garden tells him, okay, but pack yourself a bung of rum with a large opening, in other words, a cask of rum, because when they die, you need to put them in there. Sure enough, they all die, but when they arrive, they're perfectly preserved in alcohol. And so they had them all. And then we have another member of the Royal Society who cuts them up, because they got their whole, dead but whole. He cuts them up. And here you see his engraving. This is the presentation he gave to the Royal Society on the electric eels that had been shipped by Dr. Alexander Gordon. And there's the cross section of it. And those two organs that are labeled H's, they are still called Hunter's organs, after Dr. Hunter gave that presentation. So those are his, how he manufactured electricity. Anyway, they're all into electricity, and everybody gives good old Garden credit for getting those eels preserved, because he was so sure they were going to die. See, and so I want you to remember that he's important for fish. And how do we ship most of these fish? They're dried, they're skinned. It's interesting how they got into it, but he had enslaved people making these specimens for him. He was not always doing it, and he had enslaved people and black fishermen collecting these things. And so this is one of his original specimens that he gets credit for over in England. They're still preserved. They were preserved so well. And then after they finished, they varnished them with the varnish off of the varnish tree. They were using real varnish, not all the synthetic things we do. And so the reason I put this here, it's so funny. This is above, this is Catesby's rendition of the same fish. And Catesby is very much disliked by Dr. Gardner. He said he was just into pretty things and making himself famous, and he didn't do it right. And he deliberately, when he sent over this common mullet here, he sent over this mullet, and he deliberately writes this nasty thing about the man, and I have to quote here, I have to ask. This man and how he was just so ignorant of plants and animals, and he got it all messed up. He wanted them to look pretty, and he said, and where is the mullet's pectoral fin? It is missing. So he very much criticized that picture. It was not a good. So I just did a play on the nursery rhyme, you know, where is my dog gone? Where is the pectoral fin gone? He was very upset that the fin was not on his fish. Pardon? Okay. So, back quickly, so he's known for the gardenia, but here's the ironic part. He didn't find the gardenia, he didn't have a gardenia. The gardenia is from South Africa, excuse me, it's from South Africa. It was shipped from South Africa to England. It was in a garden in England, and it was after the magnolia, the most spectacular thing they had ever seen. Everybody, and even Ellis wrote, "We love this plant, we love it." And so they are making a fortune doing cuttings and producing these gardenias. And in the meantime, it doesn't have a name. So the man who has it in his garden wants to name it. Calls it a jasmine, and Ella says, no, it's not a jasmine, it's something else, it's another genus. And so he tries to argue with him, and in the meantime, everybody's arguing back and forth all over. This is all over England, and Linnaeus has never seen this plant. So now Ellis is so sure he's right, he draws a specimen, sends it up there to Linnaeus, and he wants a different name on it. They're all arguing over who to name this plant after, he said. And so to get to the end of the story, 2 years later, finally, Ellis bribes and threatens Linnaeus to name this plant after Dr. Gardner. And so that is how the gardenia got named. And Dr. Gardner in Charleston, South Carolina, never saw one until he is thrown out of the country at the end of the Revolution. So the plant he's so famous for, he never saw. I want you to know that he was most important for all his dried fish, and that there's over 50 of them still preserved in the museums in England. So there we go. So now quickly, Michelle, I wasn't going to do much on him anyway, but you're so much about him. He's a vagabond. He goes all over the place, and he's not too much identifying things here. What he's doing is bringing things. So this is all things that he brought. And I suppose probably right now, everybody loves the crepe myrtles, the tea olives, and then the tea plantation. We have we know this, the only tea plantation in North America. So they grow the Camellia sinensis there. The japonicas, the ones that flower, but he takes off after a while. My favorite trivia with him is his wife was mixed race. Okay, I got to get to Thomas Walter. This is the man, he never even apparently contacted Dr. Gardner, and they're contemporaneous. They're the same time. He had a huge plantation up in Berkeley County, and he is going to be very competitive with Michelle about how many plants he can find, how many plants he can name. And he has this huge, huge garden on his plantation. And he is going to be the first person that publishes all of our Carolina plants with their Latin names. And he gave them all these Latin names. He is going to today, over 30 plants still bear the Latin name he gave them in his book. So he gave them all these Latin names. He's buried up in Berkeley County. He came up with over 200 new species, 30 new genuses, and so he just goes on and on and on. And then he wrote the book, Flora Carolina, because he had a friend. His friend was an Englishman, John Fraser. He came over to work from the show for a while, and then the two of them, Fraser and Walter, get together and they start collecting plants all over the place. And it's Fraser, his good friend, who is not going to stay here all that long. He takes all of this information and this book back, and he gets the book published in London. So a lot of people have never heard of this man, and yet here he is. He's local, and it always amazes me to think that there's virtually or no documented contact between him and Garden at the exact same time. And it's simultaneous. Kind of interesting. So, although it might have to do with the fact that Dr. Garden was one of the King's people, a loyalist, and Walter is an officer in the Revolutionary War. But see, this is all before the Revolution. And I just think it's fascinating. All right, I got to throw this one in. Everybody knows John James Audubon. He came through here a lot. Great friends with Reverend John Bachman, the Lutheran minister. And what's going to happen is that Bachman is a naturalist, natural philosopher. There we go again. He's a natural philosopher. He knows his Latin. And he had actually come here from New York. He grew up in New York, but the family had an enslaved person, a slave, who used to take him out in the woods. He used to go as a kid, going all through the woods of New York, and that's where he learned to love plants and get interested in that. And so he comes down here to Charleston as a Lutheran minister. So he's not a doctor. He's actually a Jew up here that's not a doctor. He's the Lutheran minister. But Audubon immediately bonds with him, and he stays at Bachman's house. And in between the two, we have Maria Martin Bachman. So Maria Martin, people don't hear this word anymore, but she was the spinster in the household. Bachman was married to her sister, and Maria was the spinster, the unmarried woman living in the house, helping to take care of all the children. And what happens is Audubon taught her to paint. She painted the backgrounds in all of Audubon's quadrupeds of America. A lot of people don't realize that Audubon only did the animals and the birds. He didn't do the backgrounds. He told other people what to do. And he had Maria do all of the backgrounds in his quadrupeds of America. She did all of them. And Audubon said that she was a better artist than his artist in London. He compliments her. Now, on the other hand, he also had a little attachment to her. So you can judge how fine her paintings are, because he sent her letters, he kissed her, this and that. Bachman writes back and says, leave her alone. He's still there. They write love letters all over the place about kissing and hugging, and I can't resist. And so you get these naturalists that are competitive. And so we have, in this case, Audubon is very competitive and hated by this man up in Philadelphia called George Ord. And so George Ord puts down everything Audubon does, said no, rattlesnakes don't climb trees, but rattlesnakes do climb trees. And here's what I love. So here's two birds. So actually Audubon named two birds after Bachman. But the woodpecker, there's Mariah's woodpecker. He named it after his love in Charleston. And Ord, this is too funny what Ord wrote. Ord wrote, it's a good thing that he had no more lady friends, or every pecker would be named of his ladies. I mean, it's a wonderful pun. It means the same thing today. It meant back when he wrote it 200 years ago. He would name every pecker after his ladies. Okay, so I wanted to get that one in there. Because we all know that Bachman were extinct, but I think the last confirmed view was right outside of Charleston, wasn't it? Mount Pleasant. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I'm thinking it was in Mount Pleasant. It was right outside of Charleston, the last confirmed sighting of Mountain's warbler. And then to the end, because so many people know the poinsettia, named for Joel Poinsett. He is actually graduate of College Charleston, first American ambassador to Mexico, gets sent by President Monroe to Mexico. He was very cantankerous, very bossy, always at odds with the government. And the Mexicans came up with this word, poinsettia inicio. In other words, somebody who was nasty and cantankerous was acting like Joel Poinsett. Poinsettisimo. Anyway, bad thing in Mexico to be called. So, but he does get the wild plant, and he has cuttings in his greenhouse there in Mexico. He sends it to his friends here in Charleston. We have all these new hybrid varieties today, and so the name poinsettia still is the common name used pretty much everywhere. That is not the Latin name. It's euphorbia. So the genus was already there, and so the genus is already there. Fulcruma just means pretty. Be kind of fun to have it as poinsettia. And I went 1 minute over. Sorry. Okay, that's the end.
Wow, there's some chat here. Okay, so, any questions in the audience here? While I. Yeah.
I have a question. The first French expedition to the Carolinas.
French expedition.
Yes, that was in 1564. And on that voyage, or else in the following voyage, and they landed in Jacksonville, and they came as far as Paris Island.
Here, I was gonna say, that's down Port Royal, right?
That's right.
Port Royal.
And Theodore de Brie was the artist who came on board, and he drew 41 images that included plants, and the first image of a bird, which was a turkey. And I'm wondering, I just went on ChatGPT to find out, did any of the images that de Brie drew, did any of them include plants that were unique? And I couldn't get an answer.
See, I'll be very honest, that's a name I don't recognize. I knew about the failed settlement down at Port Royal, but I didn't realize that there was a natural history.
Well, it's all natural histories.
Yeah, no, I'm not aware of it. I'm sorry.
Growing corn, yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, and see, his name never came up in the Royal
Yeah.
Society when I was working on
I
it.
collect those images, those prints.
That was
And they,
interesting.
yeah. they're-
Can we go online and find them? Or you'll email
Of
me?
course, yeah, Theodore de Brie. In fact, I think College Charleston has the whole set. The whole set costs about
See, we've got all that stuff here. It's amazing what we've got. Okay.
So, David Quick does say that,
What I get wrong.
No, that the Mexican sunflower is not native to.
Oh, okay. Mexican sunflower is not native. That's what we just found out.
And Leighton says, first Carolina colonists placed their first bets on the trade in sugar and slaves.
Okay. Yeah, their first bet was trade in sugar and slave. Absolutely, the slavery, yeah, they brought the slave law here from Barbados, but our climate is not quite good enough to have a prosperous sugarcane crop. And the first big money making here is actually going to be on animals. They turned the cattle loose around here. The first enslaved were used as cowboys. They would go round up the free range cattle and then, of course, salt and dry the beef and ship it to the Caribbean. We were known as the colony of a colony. And I think this is an interesting thing. Did you ever think about the word cowboy? What is your image? It's the Marlboro Club. The young people don't know the Marlboro Man, but a cowboy, you know, big and but there he is, and he's got his hat and he's riding his horse, right? No, it's a boy. You see, cowboy. Did that ever click in your mind? It's because enslaved men were always known as boys. And the very first people that herded the free range cattle here were the enslaved, so they were cowboys, they weren't cowmen. And that just stuck. We don't think of it as an insult today, but it started out as part of that segregation of the black and the white. So that's the origin of the word cowboy. And then it turned out that they tried all these crops. The German immigrants tried what they knew, and the French, a lot of those Huguenots came over, and a lot of them tried a wine industry. They tried mulberries. They were going to grow silkworms, and their silkworms kept dying. They never managed to get them over here. But then finally they discovered rice was the way to go. And so once they had rice, it took off. And our rice actually has a genetic code from Madagascar. So the rice, so there's that trade again. The rice comes from Madagascar. So many of the plants, I mean, I tell people when you think you're eating Southern, you are not eating Southern, you're eating African. We still use the okra, the African name for it. Guinea squash is an old name for anybody know. The eggplant. We still use Benny. I bet most of y'all know Benny. That's the African word for sesame seed. That came here. And when they sent the sesame seed, the Benny seed, to Jefferson, Jefferson calls it Benny. He doesn't call it sesame seed. And that was so important because the Benny is over 50% oil. That was your cooking oil in the old days. Sesame seed till it was replaced by Western oil. So that's the progress of the economy and the plants. Watermelon, how can I forget watermelon? Yes, the watermelon still grows wild in Africa. And that's another interesting thing about genetics, because the old ancient watermelons were white meat and bitter, and they actually were used for storage because you could bury them. And if the skin's not broken, and they were also taken on ships as a source of water. So watermelon, but what happens is over the millennials, the Africans started preferring the sweeter watermelon, and we get this evolution from bitter to sweet. And now we know that the gene is tied to the color, and so the sweeter it got, the pinker it got. Kind of fun.
Star made a comment that, could Lawson have been an unbiased, what was he biased? He's the only one that we have single source. So, it's good that we have his source, but, is it?
Okay, so the question is Lawson biased? We are all biased. I mean, we are. We're just all biased. But he did very clearly keep showing empathy, and he said that they were being destroyed. Here's how he said. He said the Indians were being destroyed by slavery and rum. And here's another thing a lot of people don't know. For the first 10 years, we exported more Indian and slaves than we brought in African slaves. They were enslaving the Indians. So Lawson clearly states that the Native Americans were being destroyed by slavery and rum, those two things.
Were they being exported to the Indian, like to Barbados or something?
Yeah, what they found is when they tried to enslave the Native Americans here, first off, they were not used to being held down to have to do, they were used to being free range. All of our original Native Americans here were hunter-gatherers. And so they weren't, but the other thing was they knew the territory and they ran away. So it proved to be very, very difficult to enslave the Indian here. And what they discovered is they could trade them. They would take enslaved Indians and trade them for the slaves in Barbados and Jamaica. And so they brought the African slaves here, and there's some islands in the Caribbean where almost 5% of their bloodline is Native American. Because so many in those first 2 decades, so many enslaved were shipped off, Native Americans.
Yep. And then there's just, Star put a comment on there about, probably were some discussion about reparations for slaves and indigenous and all their labor, that sort of thing. And this is Logan's plan to make it enough to go into this.
This is Logan what?
Plan, the 8 children, the 8 children.
Oh, I'm sure she probably still has 8. Although maybe, I mean, I didn't research that family genealogy, but if she had 8 children, I'm guessing that she's probably has some descendants. But then you get very, very large families like the Paranos, but they had so many girls, the name died out. So there's still lots of Parano descendants, but there's none in the phone book. Well, it used to be.
Are there any other questions? Ruth, you're a gem. So fun and just full of information and yeah.
They're all gonna go home knowing Dr. Alexander Garden should be recognized for what?
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you. Y'all have a great night. Thank you.
You never can read.